Hi, I'm Andrew Francis, and we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 41 today. We begin at verses 1 to 7. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the peoples renew their strength. Let them approach, then let them speak. Let us together draw near for judgment. Who stirred up one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? He gives up nations before him, so when he tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them and passes on safely by paths his feet have not trod. Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and come. Everyone helps his neighbour and says to his brother, Be strong. The craftsman strengthens the goldsmith, and he who smooths with the hammer, him who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, It is good. And they strengthen it with nails so that it cannot be moved. In Isaiah chapter 41 verses 1 to 7, we have a scene in which God calls all the nations and their gods to stand trial before him and to present their evidence as to who really is God. It's an unusual trial because God is the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, and the bailiff. He sets the trial, he calls together the parties, presents his case, and declares the verdict. In verse 1, God tells the people to be silent and come before him. In Isaiah, the coastlands is a way of referring to the ends of the earth. In other words, he's calling all nations to come before him. Now, after they've heard out God, they are given a chance to strengthen themselves and bring whatever case they have before God. They do at least have an opportunity to answer God and respond. In verse 2, God outlines his case. One of the interesting things that differentiates Judaism and Christianity is that our scriptures claim that the God we know has made himself known in and through the history of the world. Unlike many religions of the time, and even today, which have based their beliefs on some unhistorical mythology, we believe that God has acted in and through history. And so if Isaiah is writing some 160 years before these events, he is predicting in these verses the coming of Cyrus. Isaiah is declaring that God is the one who has raised up Cyrus and the Persians to defeat the Babylonians, who had taken the Jewish people into exile, so that the Jews could finally be set free and set home. Whilst my translation doesn't make this clear, it would seem that the Hebrew lets us know that Cyrus has acted righteously or justly in his defeat of various nations. Further to this, Isaiah is making it clear that it's not just Cyrus that God has ordained and raised up, but he is the one who has been raising up people from the very beginning of creation. God has always been and will always be. God, who stands over history itself, is the one who determines what takes place on earth. He is the only one not contingent on anyone or anything. The only one who can declare, I am he. Interestingly enough, the Septuagint translation translates these last words in the Greek as ego eimi, which is exactly the same Greek used in Jesus' words in the New Testament when he also declares that I am in John 8:58 and John 18:5. No wonder his Jewish listeners reacted so strongly to the implications of his words. In verses 5 to 7, instead of turning to God in their fear and trembling, they turn to each other and to their idols. Instead of understanding that it's complete foolishness to rely on created beings and created things, they do exactly what they have always done. They rely on what they know and are used to, even though it has never saved them in the past. I can't help but relate this to my own country and culture. I live in a country in which every few years we change political parties and political leaders. Each time, most people believe that with a change of government, the new set of leaders will finally make decisions and do things that will change our country for the best. After 1 or 2 terms, the people are fed up with their government, and so they elect the opposition to take over. The process continues. I've seen similar in politically corrupt countries like Argentina. It doesn't matter how many times presidents are elected with great fervour and support, who then rip off the nation and make life worse for everyone. By the time they are ousted, people are yet again ready to throw their wholehearted support behind some new charlatan. We seem to be creatures of habit, who know from experience that the story is unlikely to truly end differently using the resources we have. But somehow we prefer to trust our human ingenuity and self-determination rather than trust in the only one who can truly help us, heal us, and save us. And so we read verses 8 to 20. But you, Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I've chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not cast you off. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Behold, all who are incensed against you shall be put to shame and confounded. Those who strive against you shall be as nothing and shall perish. You shall seek those who contend with you, but you shall not find them. Those who war against you shall be as nothing at all. For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not, I am the one who helps you. Fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I make of you a threshing sledge. New, sharp, and having teeth, you shall thresh the mountains and crush them, and you shall make the hills like chaff. And you shall winnow them, and the wind shall carry them away, and the tempest shall scatter them. And you shall rejoice in the Lord, in the Holy One of Israel you shall glory. When the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine together, that they may see and know, may consider and understand together, that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. Now Isaiah focuses on God's people. This worm, as Isaiah says, that has no hope of saving itself. God's people have no reason to be afraid. Isaiah reminds the people of who they are and what God has done for them already. He reminds them of Abraham, the friend of God, and thereby the implication that as his offspring they too are God's friends. He reminds them that God has taken them from the ends of the earth and has brought them this far. He then calls Israel his servant, a theme we'll see expanded on through the following chapters. God has not forsaken his people, and he has not cast them away. He is still their God, and they are still his people. Not only that, but God will strengthen them, and God will hold them up through his just right hand. In verses 11 to 13, we hear echoes of previous prophecies God has already given through Isaiah. All those who have caused Judah problems will be dealt with, and all their enemies will be removed, because God is with them. And as always, this is the reason why they need not fear. As Paul asked the Christians in Rome centuries later, if God is for us, who can be against us? Oswald points out that when we look at verses 10 and 13 and take them together, we see the picture of a father who is defending his child with his right hand and who is holding the child's right hand with his own left hand. God doesn't just defend his people, but he walks with them, he leads them, and he presences himself beside them in a very intimate way. In verse 14, we have the first time in Isaiah in which God is referred to as Redeemer. This should remind us of two images in the Pentateuch, in which a Redeemer is a family member who rescues a poorer relative from slavery or the impacts of poverty. We have the lovely story of Ruth, in which Boaz becomes Ruth's Redeemer through his willingness to marry her. And alternatively, a Redeemer avenges the blood of a murdered relative by hunting down the culprit and taking their life. As the Holy One of Israel, God is more than able to fulfill his role as Redeemer. Not only is God able to redeem because of his holiness, but his holiness is evidenced in his desire and ability to redeem. The other gods are, of course, incapable of redeeming anyone. In verses 15 to 16, Judah will be made a threshing sledge. A threshing sledge at the time was basically a large wooden frame with crushed rocks or metal attached to its underside, or it was a large wooden roller with stones or metal bits embedded in its surface. Either of these devices would have been dragged by animals over cut grain to separate kernels from their husks. The implications being that God would enable his people to have the strength and the power to deal with the obstacles that they faced, reducing them to nothing more than dust or chaff easily blown away by the wind. The result of this new empowering, of course, is rejoicing in God. As the people see what God has done for them, in them and through them, and as they realize where they have come from, they cannot but help rejoice in the Lord and glory in the Holy One of Israel. Finally, in verses 17 to 20, God yet again affirms that despite the powerlessness of the people, along with the difficult circumstances the people find themselves in, he can indeed satisfy them and provide abundantly for them. The wilderness places in which there is no water and little vegetation will suddenly become places with springs and all sorts of abundant foliage. And as the people witnesses, again, all these things point to the ability of God to do what no other God can possibly do. These last verses are again a powerful reminder to us that with God, nothing is impossible. Often we look at the paucity of our circumstances or the difficulties we face, and we struggle to see what can be done. Like the disciples facing a crowd of 5,000 with Jesus challenging them to feed the crowd, we can't envisage how it's possible to find the food. But it's not looking at how much we have that can tell us what God's answer is. And it's not looking at how large the giant is that we're facing and considering our smallness or our lack of weaponry that can inform how we should respond. Rather, it's only as we look into the face of our God and consider the majesty and the glory of who He is that we have any hope of discovering the resources that He can make available to us. And so we read verse 21 to 29. Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them, and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you. I stirred up one from the north, and he has come from the rising of the sun, and he shall call upon my name. He shall trample on rulers as on mortar, as a potter treads clay. Who declared it from the beginning, that we might know, and beforehand, that we might say he is right? There was none who declared it, none who proclaimed, none who heard your words. I was the first to say to Zion, behold, here they are, and I give to Jerusalem a herald of good news. But when I look, there is no one. Among these there is no counselor who, when I ask, gives an answer. Behold, they are all a delusion, their works are nothing, their metal images are empty wind. And so after this bit of an interlude, we're brought back to the court case that God has initiated. In verses 21 to 24, God asks the other gods to prove that they really have some power and knowledge. God invites them both to prophesy the future and also to explain the past in terms of what is happening now. In Isaiah, God is both foretelling the future, but he's also explaining what has happened historically, how he was involved in history, and how history has been worked to bring about the present and point to the future. In Isaiah, there's such a strong sense of God being at work in and through all things, whether it be nations rising up or nations falling, whether it be world leaders taking center stage or world leaders being deposed. The God of Israel is the God of all. He not only knows what has happened, what is happening and what will happen, he is actually behind the scenes enabling everything. Further to this, at the end of verse 23, God challenges these gods to at least do something for good or for ill. In the end, he makes it clear that they can do nothing and that the person who chooses to trust in them is an abomination. As we look at verse 25, God's making it clear many years before Cyrus' coming that he knows that it will happen. Unlike the other gods, Yahweh can speak very clearly and plainly about the rising up of this world leader and tell exactly what it is he will do and accomplish. Now, whilst there's some question regarding what is meant by the words, he shall call on my name, because there is no evidence that Cyrus ever trusted in Yahweh, it might possibly mean that he was led by God even if unknowingly and unwittingly. As John Oswald explains, the Bible is noted for the detailed and meticulously recorded predictions that it makes, especially about the exile. There is nothing like the prophecies of the exile in either the Egyptian or the Babylonian literature. Furthermore, the explicit nature of the biblical prophecies, not only about the exile but also about other matters, is unparalleled. Confidently, God can claim that he is the one who told Judah exactly what would happen, and he can also confidently send heralds of good news to Jerusalem, knowing that their proclamations will come true. Ultimately, the gods are not false because they are idols. Rather, the idols are worthless because the gods behind them are a delusion. I think this should give us some pause in our present day and age when we have many Christian prophets prophesying all sorts of things that are not actually taking place. Many of them, I think, are prophesying what they would like to see happen or what they think best rather than what God is declaring will indeed happen. Isaiah, however, could prophesy with confidence what God would do in spite of the circumstances that seem to say many different things. He could also see in the very difficult circumstances of nations rising against nations and even the future exile of his nation that God was behind these things too. I suspect that if we cannot see God's work in the difficulties, then we're also going to be unable to see what God will do. Further to this, if we understand a book like Isaiah and the work of God in the past, then we'll also understand better the work of God in the present, even in situations that don't make a lot of sense to us or mightn't be what we want or expect. As I've often argued, we need to have a mind and thinking that is shaped by the witness of Scripture. If we have such a mind, then we will not be shocked that the greatest work of God happened in the seeming defeat of God in Jesus' death on the cross. Isaiah is to all intents and purposes offering us a cross-shaped theology that points to God's life and purpose coming out of death, destruction, and exile. I trust that you'll be encouraged again in these words from the prophet Isaiah. God bless you.